I wrote about this, but I really wanted to talk to all of you about it here as well. Over the past year or so, there have been several high-profile cases of evangelical leaders or artists or pastors or others who have announced that they don't identify as Christians anymore, and that they're walking away from the faith. Um, as I think about that, I think not so much about those really high profile cases that make the headlines, but more about all of the cases that I have seen throughout my life that didn't make any headlines, of names that people don't know, or people don't know about what's going on in their lives, but also people that once were theologically solid, people who seem to be on fire from the Lord, who one day just say, that's it. I'm quitting. I'm done with this. I'm walking away. And as I was grappling with this, I was thinking, I don't know about you. I'm sure you know people like that. Maybe you're somebody who's just sort of right on the edge of battling with that yourself. But I know that some things tend to show up in my own life when I'm faced with that I'm not very proud of, and I don't think really reflect the mind and the heart of Jesus. And so these are some things that I tend to struggle with. Maybe you do, and maybe you don't. When I have somebody that I love or somebody that I respect who walks away from the faith, who deconverts, to use the language that people tend to use now, the first thing I have to do is to deal with a sense of anger. Sometimes my reaction is to act almost as though somebody has betrayed me. As though Christianity were some sort of a tribe or a village or a political party or something like that, and you were supposed to be with us and you've walked away. And I've gotten angry about that, and sometimes shocked. How could this happen? Well, if you think about the way that the Bible speaks of this, the Bible gives us example after example after example after example of this happening. So there can be a sort of narrative that people can, when they see a person falling away that they love, there can be a sort of narrative that they build around it, kind of similar to what happens when somebody gets divorced. That you thought, man, I just thought they were so in love, and this just means true love can't happen, and marriage is falling apart, generally, when that's not really the case. Sometimes people can fill in this narrative of, well, the world is secularizing, and religion is on its way out, and this one person walking away is evidence of that. It's one piece of that wall. And so atheists can think that. See, this Christian is not a Christian anymore. Or Christians can think that and can have this sense of, how can this happen, and really be thrown by that. When in reality, Jesus talks about this repeatedly. The book of Acts shows us this repeatedly. Apostle Paul talks about this as well. So that sense of shock and anger really isn't one that's appropriate for a Christian. The other problem that I tend to have sometimes is showing mercy toward that person. And I find it easier, I think, to show mercy and to have compassion upon lost people that are really clearly lost. So I get what Jesus is saying about judgment, but it's easier for me when it's a really clear line. So tax collectors and prostitutes, okay, I can understand that. But when you're dealing with somebody who maybe used to sing hymns right next to me in church, or used to do evangelism with me in a campus ministry, or preached a message right before me at some church, something like that, then I tend not to have that same sort of mercy. But if you realize, in most cases, what's going on here, usually there's a great deal of pain. Now, sometimes you have people who just have gone through a cognitive sort of process. They're weighing arguments and coming to conclude that they don't believe that anymore, in the same way that we might change our opinion about any number of things. I've almost never seen those, though. In most cases, somebody who falls away is somebody who's been through a lot of pain. Maybe it's somebody who's been through some suffering in his or her life and can't understand where God is in all of that. Maybe it's somebody who just kept drifting further and further and further away from the Lord until they're in the middle of this sort of dark night of the soul and they don't know how to get home. Sometimes it's people who have had awful situations with Christianity or with churches. I mean, I've seen people shredded by the church. And there have been experiences in my own life where I have said, I'm really glad that I experienced whatever this particular thing was now and not at an earlier point in my life, because I'm not sure that my faith would have been strong enough to be able to tell the difference between Jesus and religious people. And so sometimes people have been through that. And so we ought to have a sense of understanding, a sense of compassion there, and not react with a sense of, you have somehow betrayed me. The Bible speaks really, really sharply about people who are within the tent. But if you think about how sharply the Bible speaks, it's usually not toward the people who walk away, not toward the wandering sheep, as Jesus would put it, but toward the wolves who come in pretending to be sheep. So the false teachers who are staying within the church. The Bible speaks really, really clearly about that. I find it sometimes hard for me to make that distinction. And so when John says, for instance, in 1 John 2, they went out from us because they were not of us. I quote that a lot in these sorts of situations, but sometimes I find that the way I quote that is really an equivalent to, well, we should have known that he or she was a fraud from the beginning. That's not what John's doing there. What John's doing there is giving reassurance to the church that, as one New Testament scholar put it, the people who are walking away aren't challenging the integrity of Christ. It's hard for me sometimes to show mercy. And then it's also hard for me sometimes not to be thrown by this, because I look at people who sometimes are theologically more rigorous than I am, who maybe their prayer lives seem to be more rigorous than mine, who sometimes seem to display the fruit of the Spirit much more than normal people do. And I think, well, if that can happen to him, or if that can happen to her, then how do I know that it won't happen to me? And it can really sort of throw me for a minute. And I wonder if that might be the case for you as well. Well, what I would say to you is, I think that little saying there, but for the grace of God go I, has been turned into a sort of Pharisaical sort of statement, where a lot of times when we say that, what we mean is what Jesus condemns in the mouth of the Pharisee when he says, thank you, God, that I am not like this tax collector over here, this publican over here. And that's sometimes what those words seem to mean. But the words are literally true. The words are literally true. And so when you say, there but for the grace of God go I, what you're really saying is, none of us come before God on the basis of working ourselves up to it. None of us come before God on the basis of how rigorous our theological propositions are. We come before God by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. So, as Paul says to the church at Corinth, what do you have that you didn't receive? And if you didn't receive it, then why do you brag as though you didn't? So if you received it, why do you brag as though you didn't? So there's a sense in which that statement is so literally true that what it ought to cause us to do is to turn ourselves back toward that sense of who we are before God as sinners in need of grace, and to understand what's happening in Romans chapter 5, where Paul says that the love of God is being poured out in our hearts, and that this comes through suffering, which builds endurance, which builds character, which builds hope, and that hope does not put to shame. So the proper response, I think, and it's a hard one for me, when I see someone walking away from the faith is not to sit down and say, well, here's all the ways that I'm holier than she was, or here's all the ways where my theology's better than his was. Here are all the ways that I know I will never be in that situation. It's to say, God, I'm a sinner. Have mercy on me. Left to myself, I'm prone to wander, as the hymn puts it. Lord, I feel it. Take my heart, bind and seal it. That's the proper prayer there. That's actually how God keeps us, is not with our sense of arrogance, but with our sense of vulnerability. And the last thing I would say is, if you've got somebody in your life like this, don't give up on them. That's hard for me to do. It's again, easy for me to keep hoping and praying for somebody that's very clearly a pagan in my mind. Sometimes it's really hard for somebody that I know used to be part of the fold and who knows all the language and who knows all the songs and all of that. But if you look at those examples I talked about earlier in the Bible, you have some of them who never were believers, just as Jesus talks about in his parable of the sower and the soils. They falsely professed Christ, and then that came to be seen. But then you have others, Simon Peter, hard to more definitively walk away from the faith than to curse the name of Jesus and deny you know him as he's being crucified. But what happened? He was going through this darkness. He was going through this crisis. He was wandering away from the fold. But Jesus, like a shepherd, went out into the woods and brought him back. That happens a lot. Maybe it's happened to you. Maybe it will. And it may be what's happening in the life of someone that you love. And so show some mercy, stand firm in the faith, and pray. Okay. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Do you agree? Do you disagree with what we talked about today? Let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you'd like for us to talk about in the future on this channel. And don't forget to like or share this video if you found it helpful, and make sure that you subscribe and hit notifications so that you can get all of our new videos when they release.